Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and my recording. Now I would like to share with you another subject in psychology. This time we're going to talk about learning and memory. Let me share with you my screen. Learning and memory. Learning principle, the role of surprise. Learning is the acquisition of information. Memory is the retention of information. Pavlovian classical conditioning. It's about learning that associates a stimulus with an outcome. Rescorla-Wagner rule. It's a rule that determines how much is learned based on the prediction error. What is a prediction error? It's the difference between what is predicted based on prior learning and what actually occurs. It's important to Rescorla-Wagner rule. Here you can see about the prediction error, prediction based on prior learning, and what actually occurs. You see here there is a difference. The bigger the difference is between the prediction or the prediction from the previous learning and what actually occurs, then the more you learn. That's the prediction error, and that's the principle. Memory. Here you can see sensory input, then it comes through sensory memory, encoding, working or short-term memory, and then encoding to be kept in the long-term memory. Sometimes the long-term memory is also retrieved when we need that in our short-term memory. The working or short-term memory is also called rehearsal memory. Components of working memory. There are 4 components of working memory. The first one is central executive. Central executive directs the overall action. It plans and controls the sequence of actions that need to be done, divides and allocates attention to the other subsystem, and integrate information within the episodic buffer. Central executive also monitors progress as interim steps are completed. There are 3 other components of the working memory: visual spatial sketchpad, episodic buffer, and phonological loop. Visual spatial sketchpad briefly stores visual and spatial information, for example, someone's face or your office layout. Both visual and phonological loop can be active simultaneously. Episodic buffer briefly stores information from long-term memory and phonological and/or visual spatial subsystems that can be integrated, manipulated, and made available for conscious awareness. Phonological loop briefly stores mental representation of sounds, active when you listen to a spoken word or you sound out a word you read. Silently repeating the word will briefly refresh the acoustic codes stored in the phonological store. The Rescorla-Wagner model simplified. In 1972, Rescorla and Wagner proposed a mathematical model to explain the amount of learning that occurs on each trial on Pavlovian learning. This model recognized two important things. First, learning will occur if what happens on the trial does not match the expectation of the organism. Surprise is important. If you are surprised by a US or unconditioned stimulus that you do not expect, you will learn. Secondly, this expectation on any given trial is based on the predictive value of all of the stimuli present. What you expect on any given trial depends on what you have already learned. If you have no experience with a given CS, conditioned stimulus, then it predicts nothing and you expect nothing. If the unconditioned stimulus occurs, you are surprised. You learn a lot about the conditioned stimulus prediction of the unconditioned stimulus. If you have had many past experiences where the conditioned stimulus occurs, then the unconditioned stimulus follows. Then you have learned that the conditioned stimulus means the unconditioned stimulus is coming. And when the unconditioned stimulus comes, you are not terribly surprised. You learn a little more about the conditioned stimulus prediction of the unconditioned stimulus. Blocking. One of the most important contributions made by the RW model is that it predicts blocking and unblocking. Blocking occurs when a novel stimulus, because it is novel, it has no predictive value, is presented together with a well-established conditioned stimulus. In blocking, when the novel stimulus is introduced and the unconditioned stimulus occurs, there is no surprise because the conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. No surprise means no learning. Midbrain and orbitofrontal cortex work together to regulate learning as a result of surprise. You can see here on the right side structures of the brain. The forebrain here, midbrain, and hindbrain make up the three major parts of the brain. Here you can see where the midbrain is. Midbrain. Here is the midbrain in the middle here. How about orbitofrontal cortex? Here is where orbitofrontal cortex located. Midbrain and orbitofrontal cortex work together to regulate learning as a result of surprise. You can also see the brain anatomy here. We have hypothalamus, thalamus, pineal gland, as well as other parts like cerebellum. And here's the brain's stem. You can see the midbrain here again, here in the middle. Pons and medulla here. What are the three particular aspects of memory? Visual memory. Memory persists for different length of time. Memory stays in the specific areas in the brain, takes time to stabilize, and supported by synaptic plasticity. Pavlovian fear memories in the amygdala, brain area in the temporal lobe involved in Pavlovian conditioning and emotional processing. Memory is supported by decreases in synaptic strength, motor memories in the cerebellum. Unconscious or non-declarative forms of memory. There are three parts here. Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning, fear conditioning, association of previously meaningless stimulus and aversive outcome, unconditioned stimulus, the outcome that drives learning in Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning. Conditioned stimulus, previously neutral stimulus that's conditioned to predict an outcome. Number 2, perceptual learning or perceptual memory. Involves learning a perceptual information or visual memory. It has three parts here, three kinds of memories. Visual memory has, sensory iconic memory, a very short-lasting memory of visual information for around 1 second. Short-term memory, memory retention of a few minutes to hours, supported by visual cortical neurons that carry on firing even after the visual stimulus disappears. Supported by sustained neural activity in inferotemporal cortex. If you want to see where inferotemporal cortex is, you can see the first picture here on the top. Here is where inferotemporal cortex is located. Long-term memory lasts to a lifetime, depends on specific areas in temporal lobe. Here you see on the last picture here on the bottom, you can see where temporal lobe is located here on the left side, bottom. So it depends on specific areas in temporal lobe. The long-term memory requires the perirenal and parahippocampal cortexes. You can see here the parahippocampal cortex on the second picture on the left-hand side. Parahippocampal cortex. The last part is the procedural memory. Involves the acquisition of skills, for example, motor learning movements, such as playing piano. Areas of brain involved, prefrontal cortex and cerebellum. You can see here cerebellum on the left-hand side is actually the last picture here, cerebellum. Visual stream. Visual information processed through the ventral visual stream, you can see here. So the visual information is processed to the ventral visual stream here. Look at the picture on the left-hand side. Visual information is processed to the ventral visual stream, starting from the occipital lobe. You can see here on the left-hand side, the picture here, to the temporal lobe. Visual information is processed through the ventral visual system, starting from occipital lobe here to the temporal lobe here on the left-hand side. On the other picture on the right-hand side, bottom right, you can see motor areas is another brain picture. Here, primary motor cortex in the middle, motor association area, and then frontal eyelid. And also sensory areas and related association areas here on the right-hand side. Primary somatosensory cortex, sensory association area, and Wernicke's area. General interpretation area, here you can see very little here. Primary visual cortex, visual association area, primary auditory cortex here in the middle, and auditory association area also in the middle. The prefrontal cortex here, you can see here, the Broca's area. Associative learning. Forms of learning that involve predictive links between events. The events can be broken down into stimuli, sounds, sights, smells, and responses, actions, behaviors. Associations involving just stimuli mostly result from Pavlovian conditioning, learning the predictive stimuli and outcome. The responses come from instrumental conditioning, learning that associates an action with an outcome, where a behavior is done to get a desired effect. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a non-invasive method of altering brain activity in humans. Uses electromagnetic to induce small electrical currents on a region in the brain. The goal is to depolarize neurons in the region, results in either activation of the target region or inhibition, depending on the stimulation of excitatory or inhibitory neurons. Let's learn about the keywords here. Working memory, short-term store of information in an online state for current processing and use. Mnemonic, techniques or strategies to improve memory. Repetition suppression, decrease in responding. The stimulus is no longer novel. Methods to study memory location. There are two methods here, causal strategies and correlational strategies. Causal strategies demonstrate that a brain area is needed for memory function. For example, lesions or patient studies, functional inactivation, TMS in humans, demonstrate requirement for a brain area in memory processing. Correlational strategies. A brain area is involved in some way in memory function. Do not disrupt the brain. Record the activation of the brain in various ways in response to cognitive function. For example, electrophysiology, measuring an increase in brain activity during an aspect of behavior, functional brain imaging, and memory processing. Encoding long-last memories. Cellular consolidation is a time-dependent stabilization of memory in the brain from minutes to hours. Requires synthesis of new proteins. Consolidation blockers impair LTM. I would suggest that is long-term memory, but leave STM intact, short-term memory. An NMDA receptor, subtype of glutamatergic receptor involved in learning with links to ERK or MAPK activation. Double dissociations. Functions or processes are separable and independent in the brain. Memories encoded in the brain through changes in synaptic plasticity. What is synaptic plasticity? It's an alteration in synapse strength. For example, postsynaptic neuron being activated by a presynaptic activity. Here you can see the picture of synaptic plasticity that can change either the amount of neurotransmitter released or the number of postsynaptic receptors available, resulting in changes in synaptic strength. Synaptic plasticity and LTP. Long-term potentiation, or LTP, is persistent enhancement of postsynaptic response. If neuron A repeatedly causes neuron B to fire, some growth process or metabolic change takes place in one or both cells, such that A becomes more efficient at causing B to fire. LTP, long-term potentiation. Associative LTP depends on the co-activation of two inputs and strengthens both pathways. Non-associative LTP activated by a single input pathway. Procedural memory involves the acquisition of skills such as motor learning movements like playing piano, areas of brain involved, prefrontal cortex and cerebellum. Here you can see the cerebellum here. Implicit learning, unconscious learning, including Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning. Long-term depression, or LTD, persistent reduction of postsynaptic response. Conscious forms of learning and memory. Conscious or explicit or declarative memories are memories which we are fully aware. For example, episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memory is retention of information of personal life events, details of time and place. Semantic memory is retention of factual information. Episodic and semantic memories are separate in the brain. Amnesics, for example, patient HM, have a failure of episodic memory, usually with intact semantic memory. That means that patient doesn't remember the personal events, details of time and place, but that person still remembers the facts, the factual information. Semantic dementia is a condition with selective loss of semantic memory. Hippocampus and memory. Damage to the hippocampus impairs episodic memory. That means that person forgets about the life events, the time and places. Semantic memory relies instead upon the perihinal cortex. Here on the picture on the right-hand side, you can see perihinal cortex here at the bottom. The hippocampus is also important for spatial memory. Here is hippocampus on a little bit on the right side, in the middle, but below as well. Hippocampus is important for spatial memory, activated during a spatial navigation task in humans. Amnesics also suffer impairment in spatial navigation of a previously familiar environment. Experimental damage to the hippocampus in rodents impairs spatial learning in the water maze. Here is another picture of hippocampus on the right-hand side. Systems level consolidation. Hippocampus, not always for old memories. There is a temporal gradient of retrograde amnesia. Very old episodic memories remain intact in amnesics. Month-old spatial memories are unaffected by hippocampal lesions in rodents. Systems consolidation describes the transfer of dependence of old memories to the cortex. Episodic memories rely upon binding together different cortical areas. The hippocampus can do this quickly, and so is necessary initially to retrieve episodic memories. When the cortical areas are linked together directly, the hippocampus is no longer essential for memory retrieval. Remember here, hippocampus can do this quickly, and so is necessary to retrieve episodic memories. Amnesia. There are two kinds of amnesia: anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is the failure to form new memories after brain damage. Retrograde amnesia is memory loss prior to brain damage. Multiple trace theory. Some patients show a flat retrograde amnesia. No old memories remain intact. Hippocampus is always necessary for episodic memory retrieval. Hippocampus is usually only partially damaged. Retrieval of a memory lays down a new overlapping trace. The older the memory, the more traces it will have. The more traces there are, the greater the chance that one or more will be left intact with partial hippocampal damage. This would lead sometimes to flat retrograde amnesia and sometimes to temporal gradient of retrograde amnesia. Key points. The loss of pre-existing memories, retrograde amnesia, follows a temporal gradient. More recent memories are more likely to be impaired. System consolidation accounts for the temporal gradient of retrograde amnesia. That's it for today. Thank you for learning with me. I hope you enjoy learning about learning and memory. See you next time.